Right, here we go. We're in the room. All right. As always, if you are coming in through the Tour of Idaho Facebook page, please be sure to give StreamYard your credentials. If you're coming in through the motorcyclejazz.com Facebook page or through YouTube, sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. You can always just put your name at the end of your comments so we know who you are. I got word just before we went on the air from my internet service provider that some of their service is out tonight, but I have one of these fancy dual routers that balances the load back and forth between two ISPs, so hopefully that won't slow us down any. All right. I see the room is already starting to populate. There we go. Hey, Jim. I have with me tonight a co-host. Michael Knight is going to do what Jim Spooner and Jeff and some other fellows have done lately. He's just going to hang out with me tonight and co-host and answer questions. Hello, Sean. And we also have a guest tonight. We're going to bring in Sean Smith a little bit later on, and we're both going to have some questions for him, like how is it that you managed to ride so much trail and saw so much all summer long? I think that'd be a good answer. Hello, Jake. So, updates. As most of you probably know, hello, Brian. We had a team that started a couple days ago, Sawdust. Most of you are aware of the fact that they retired before they got to Pocatello, which was a shame. A little bit about these guys. They're very good riders. They did a very reasonable job of preparing. They've had bad luck 2 years in a row. They showed up last year, and there was a thunderstorm of biblical proportions that came roaring up the valley while they were trying to do that stuff around Robber's Roost. And that stuff, that clay soil, when it gets a little bit of rain in it, you're kind of knackered. And so in the ensuing sort of mudslog, trying to get their bikes up some of those steep hills, they packed everything. I mean, when they showed up at my house, their chains, their cogs, everything on those bikes was packed with mud. And the problem with that is you ride that way a little bit, and after a while, unless you're willing to take the time to take everything apart, which they didn't have, and clear all that stuff out, you're kind of knackered. Those guys had a lot of trouble with their bikes last year, I think, that was related to the mud. And finally, they started having major systems go out. One of them lost a clutch, their chains, their bearings, everything was pretty knackered. So they come back again this year, and they're on different bikes. And one of the things that we tell people, and Michael, you could chime in on this anytime you want because this is an area of expertise of yours. Most bikes these days, in order to meet emissions, come from the factory very, very, very lean. So in addition to that, if you select the map that says fuel economy, which a lot of people would do for Tour of Idaho style riding, what you've done is leaned it out even more. And when you start getting into some of these aftermarket maps and things that do aftermarket to try to tart up the performance a little bit, rarely does that richen the mix. Usually it leans it out more because in terms of performance, a hot bike is a fast bike. Race engines are basically grenades. When I was road racing, I never got through more than 3 or 4 races without having to rebuild a motor because you build them you make them run as hot as possible because that's how you extract the maximum amount of power out of them for a given RPM. So whenever you get a bike and you are looking, hello Jeff, at like some of these performance maps or the fuel conservation map on top of an already lean mix to get it to meet emissions, you're looking at trouble on hot days. The engine's already running hot, and it's going to run super hot when you're trying to crawl up some of these great big long climbs that we have on the tour. Michael, am I saying anything you disagree with so far?
No, I don't. In fact, the thought that came to my mind is, again, I know you kind of razz me all the time, Martin, because my boys spend a fair amount of time not only trail riding but also racing, and they get questions all the time. But this actually relates to the tour in that people ask them all the time what they do to what gas they run, what motors, who does their motors, all that. And I would say 99% of the time our motors are completely stock. It's more about rider and than anything else, and that applies to the tour. I mean, I didn't do anything extreme to as far as modifications to my bike, and I get questions all the time, private messages and whatnot to me, asking me, and other than just your off-the-shelf standard mods to my bike, that's all I did. Because it's not about performance; it's about endurance and just getting through the tour. So no, that's spot on, Martin.
So one thing that you should do before you show up here, and this would have helped Sawdust a lot, is you should check your map and make sure you are running the richest map you can. Those guys remapped in my garage yesterday, and they're a lot happier today where they're at. They haven't had the troubles that they had before. But there are some sort of poor people's way to accomplish the same thing. You get out and your bike is running at 250 degrees every time you go up a climb or something. You don't have the ability to swap the map on the fly. One thing that I've done before that accomplishes the same thing. Now, this is going to sound crazy. Pull out another filter skin and pop it on your air filter, and that'll richen up the mix right away. You're restricting the air intake. Motors are basically simple at some level. They take fuel and they take air, and there's a lot more air than there is fuel. And the more air there is and less fuel, the hotter the mix. So if you are running an already lean mix, anything that you do to richen that mix up, i.e. restrict the flow of air, is going to richen the mix up, and it'll cool your motor down a little bit. I run all on my bike super rich because every motorcycle ever built has plenty enough performance for me. What I want is the thing not to break. So I don't do any of these things like open up the air boxes, and I don't put any of the race maps in them or any of that kind of stuff. Even when I was road racing, I didn't really modify. I degree the cams a little bit, but that's all I would do because I race super stock class. The reason that the motors didn't last very long is because we're running them at redline the whole time. I mean, you're running them at redline for significant portions of a race, and it's really hot. The place where I road race is Willow Springs in Southern California, and it was typically 140 degrees on the asphalt out there. So it's just really, really hard on engines. And the bike I raced had a red line of 16,000 RPM, so they just don't last that long if you run them full on at red line. So those of you that are still in the queue waiting to show up, this is a problem that we have every year. People show up with bikes that have interesting mods done to them, or they're just too lean. You get out on these really hot days, and that's probably going to cause you some trouble because on some of these long, slow climbs, it's really difficult to go fast enough to run enough air through the motor to keep the thing cool. The one thing that those guys did on day one that saved their bacon is they were running water and engine ice, which, as you know, I prefer. I think Evans is fine for racing, but Evans is going to cause your motor to run even hotter. So I disagree with the whole Evans thing. I know some people are sold on it. It's great for racing. I used it in all my race bikes, but I don't use it for trail riding. The other thing is, Evans isn't really compatible with water, so you kind of have to make a choice. And if you run out of Evans in the middle of the woods, you're unlikely to find any more. So that's what got those guys. The reason you saw an awful lot of 0 mile per hour track points is because they were sitting down waiting for their bikes to cool down an awful lot. And then they had a side hill incident at the end of the day in a place where you don't really want to have a side hill incident. And their comment to me through the PLB is, man, we sure are glad we have the good rescue kit because I saw that bike and it looked like somebody had taken an industrial-sized cheese grater to it. So they came here, and I like these guys an awful lot. They're super good dudes. I hate to see anybody go away totally empty-handed because you spend a year preparing for this. So I sent those guys off on a mission, and it's double knot, top secret spy stuff, James Bond kind of deal. But they're going to do something that's going to make the tour next year better. They're out checking out some stuff for me, and they were really happy when I showed them what I wanted them to do. So I think that they're happy. They're going to be able to have a good time in Idaho, and that's that. Now, without any further ado, that's all the announcements I have. Fires and stuff, we'll talk about that when the time comes. There's not another team out until Thursday, I think, and I haven't heard from that team at all in months, so I don't know if they're showing up or not. But the floodgates are going to burst, I think, about the weekend. But I want to introduce my co-host tonight and let him talk for a little while. Michael Knight, who many of you know, is a tour finisher, showed up with a team of 3 a couple of years ago that ended up becoming a team of 2. And Michael Knight is one of my favorite people in the universe because he's another one of these kind of guys that the disconnect between his ability And what he would tell you about his ability is enormous. So he's this incredibly humble guy. You meet him, and he doesn't talk about how good he is or anything, but the guy is just like he's one of these pro-level riders. The guy is super good. He's one of the nicest people I have ever met, one of the most completely respectful people I've ever met. And we're stoked to have him in our community, man. The guy is an absolute stud on a motorcycle. Michael Knight, take it away. I gave you a great intro. Roll
Wow,
it.
you tell big tales there, Martin. Thank you.
No, I don't.
Well, hey everybody, I am ecstatic at an opportunity to just have an excuse to talk about the Tour of Idaho. This time of year rolls around. It's been 2 years now already. I did it in 2020, and literally, like, I looked for an opportunity. I've joked with Martin about this, and my family will tell you, particularly my wife. There is literally not a day since I completed the tour 2 years ago that I have not made mention in some form or fashion of the tour experience in my life. Literally, whether it's, I'll give you a simple example. I get up in the morning early and I walk with my wife. And the other morning, I was looking at the mountains. I live in northern Utah, and I'm seeing this beautiful sunrise. And of course, what do I say? I say, that reminds me of the tour. I said, that's one of the things I miss about the tour. Every morning, up before the sun, and on top of a mountain somewhere, riding my motorcycle in Idaho and watching the sunrise. I mean, I could go all day with examples like that. So, and for those who may not know me, again, I don't expect everybody does. Just a little bit of context. I just love this kind of stuff. I love riding my motorcycle. I love Idaho. I love trail riding. And I had been dreaming about doing the tour literally since about 2005, 2006, in its earliest conception, back when Martin had the webpage up. I remember stumbling upon it because I was concocting a kind of a similar little 3-day ride that I thought was relative to what I had done at that point in my riding and a dual sporting type of experience, that was from my house to Island Park, Idaho. And anyway, I did that, and we had quite an adventure. And then from that point forward, it just lit the fire. But, you know, having a young family and work and different things, it was crazy that things like COVID lined up such that it actually was the perfect year for me to do it. So, and I know a lot of you may or may not have seen some of the videos that I produced after our tour. I get messages quite literally every week, almost every day still. People pinging me with questions and different things. So I'm happy to deflect some of that off of Martin, who I know just gets inundated with those types of questions. So that's a little bit about me. I'm here. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm happy to, you know, tell some tall tales or whatever you're interested in. But happy to be here tonight.
So we have a couple of experts tonight. I'm going to bring in the other one in just a minute. But one of the best guys in the world to ask questions about the Tour of Idaho is Michael Knight. So any questions that you have, put them to him. Now, his perspective is way different than mine, too. And what I tell people a lot, Jimmy and I had this conversation. Michael and I have had it a little bit. Brent, your writing partner, and I have had it. You know, in the beginning, there's all these vastly diverse perspectives about the tour. This is the way I think it's going to work. And by the time you get to the end of it, you couldn't live off the difference between what people think. So everybody kind of goes into it thinking, you know, because they superimpose their own experience on top of it. Because there's not a template for anything like this out here. This isn't like going to Baja. You know, it's not like Erzberg or anything like that. It's its own thing. And so what people necessarily do is they take the template of their own experience, they superimpose it over top of what they think is going to happen, and there's nothing wrong with that. You know, we try to tell people this is probably the best practice, but, you know, if you don't agree with that, you knock yourself out. But in the end, it's remarkable how much agreement there is with everybody about, yeah, you know, a few little things here and there aside, this is probably the best practice. And you came into this from a totally different, you know, I call it a different background. You deny that. You say, no, we're more alike than you think. But when I think of you, I think of Erzberg, ISDE, all this kind of stuff. You know, you're a pretty solid dude, and I'm not. I'm just an old guy that likes to ride motorcycles in the woods. But in the end, we kind of thought about it in a pretty similar way, I think.
That's a really fair point. And I know, I'll give you an example. So yeah, it's just natural. I mean, we superimpose our own experiences on our own preparation, and naturally we try to glean information from other people. But I'll give you an example. I have three boys. They all ride competitively, but also are fanatical trail riders. And one of the things over the years in participating in the ISDE, for those who may or may not be familiar with it, it's more of an endurance event than it is a race. And so even though Martin, and I agree with him, is always saying, this is not a race, but the preparation or my experience that I brought to the tour, preparing my bike, my mind, and my body, was based on what does it take to finish 6 days of riding at an international level versus maybe a 2-hour local hare scrambles event. And they're night and day difference, because you're riding to finish for, this is what I tell my boys, you're riding to finish for 6 days. You're not trying to, put down a hot lap on a motocross track. So we actually pull that same experience into our preparation for the tour, or at least I did. And honestly, 90% of it was relevant because of the way, things like, okay, your chain and sprockets have got to last for 10 days. Those tires, those wheels, they've got to last for 10 days, 13 days now. Your body, your hands, blisters, the gear that you wear, taking your helmet on and off, literally, hundreds of times. You develop sores behind your ears and things like that. And that's actually things that we had experience with that, in my opinion, was very relevant for the tour. So go ahead.
I tell people even something as minute as how you get it on and off your bike makes a big difference when you do it 100 times a day. You have to think about little things like that, and your experience really helped you with that.
Yeah.
We got some questions for you right here. Let's see. Right. Okay, here we go. Here's the one that always starts trouble. You ran Nitro Moose, correct?
Oh no. Okay. I anticipated that question, and I'll just address it head on. The short answer is yes, I did. Does that mean you should, or does that mean you shouldn't? The answer is neither. I'm gonna play Switzerland on this one. I will simply tell you what my experience was. For example, at the 6 days, you run mooses, but you have the luxury of having a spare set. You have to change them at the end of every day in 15 minutes, and you have fresh tires. You do not have that luxury on the tour, and I will own the fact that it almost burned us. But I will also say that through proper preparation and knowledge of what sizes and temperatures and different things like that we ran, I ended up running my rear moose for like another 1,000 miles on my same bike, even after the tour. However, I have personal knowledge of a team last year who I feel really, really bad, because I feel like I had some accountability there, because they inquired of me what I used, and I just was honest. I said, this is what worked for me. And it was the reason their tour ended. So I am not going to say whether you should or shouldn't. One other thing was, when we got to Salmon on day 5, I bought a new rear wheel, and I had the opportunity to inspect my moose when we swapped it. But I have a lot of experience changing mooses. I'm not saying I'm the world's best. And I struggled. Brent and I were in the hot parking lot on the backside of Les Schwab. And I thought, and this is where my ego got me a little bit, that I was going to be able to do it with the tire irons that I had. And we struggled. The thing was inflated a little bit. So we ended up going in the shop, and they assisted us with their big mechanical tire changer. And nobody, even though I understand now that's not an option this year, should expect that the same people, the same guys would offer you that option. So we got a little lucky. They did work for me, but I'm as much experience as I have with them, I may or may not use them again if I was making another tour attempt. That's for you to decide. So hopefully that answers the question. Again, just because it worked for me doesn't mean it'll work for you, because it's obviously worked for some and it's failed others.
And that's a great answer. And all of you should think really hard about what you just heard. What works for Michael Knight doesn't work for me. It may not work for you. What works for Jimmy Lewis probably won't work for you. These guys ride motorcycles for a living. That's all they do. They know everything there is to know about that stuff. And when you're installing a bib moose, there's some technique involved in that. There's some things you need to know, how to lube it. All that stuff is really important. And if you don't know all of that, even how it responds to like bouncing off rocks for 100 miles. All of those things are important. And if you're a professional rider, you have a lot more leeway in knowing how to make things work than if you don't. So when it comes to stuff like that, all I can tell you is what the statistics are. And there was a team last year that got screwed because their mooses blew up in the middle of nowhere, and you're knackered when that happens. And I would say that over the course of the tour, tubeless and moose are the two biggest mechanical failures that we've seen through the years. Now, some people run them, and they're fine. Another team of pros came a few years before Michael and Brent. There was a team, sort of a climb and an industry team that came through a few years ago. We called them the Movie Stars, Tony Jenkins and that crew. And those guys ran bib mooses, and to the person, they said the last day we were scared to death. We thought these things were going to come apart the last day when we could almost see Sundance. We might have to carry our bikes on our backs up to the lookout. So just if you want to run that stuff, run it, but just beware that most people would tell you in the end they would have thought a lot harder about just tires and tubes if they had to do it again. And I think you're crazy if you run a tubeless. I'll just tell you flat out, you're out of your mind if you do that.
I wouldn't. I will say that much. I would not run tubeless. It was never even a consideration for me. Just one other little tidbit of information. So two things again that I did when I changed when I changed the tire on day 5 in Salmon. I intentionally bought a cheap Kenda Trackmaster. The ones that have been around forever, and they run small. They're a narrow tire. And I bought it intentionally because I had the mid-size Nitro Moose, and I bought a tire that I knew was one size smaller. Again, intentionally knowing that the Moose would then fill that tire really, really tight, and then I could make it another 5 days. Brent ran his same rear tire. This was my teammate. The entire tour, his rear tire did better than mine. I think it was a Dunlop D505, I think. But his moose, and he bought the biggest moose he could at the beginning, and exactly what Martin just said, we were super nervous. And I've admitted this to a lot of people, but day 10, about 9.5, I was riding behind him, just waiting for that thing to come off the rear wheel. So we lucked out. So again, if I'd had to do it over again, I'm not saying that mooses are necessarily the way to go. I'm simply saying that they worked for us. And one other huge variable is, and you can't control this, if you had fires and you have a huge reroute and all of a sudden you're blasting 100 miles of asphalt and it's 95 degrees, well, that's a huge variable that could impact the life of your moose.
One of these days, that technology is going to get to the point where it's more reliable than traditional tubes. But I just don't think we're at that point yet. There's still too many variables because the friction in those things is something that's really, you have to really worry about the friction because they can get really hot. It's not inside, there's not a bunch of air like there is in a tire and a tube. So when that thing gets hot, it's harder for it to dissipate the heat. And like you said, if you're rolling down the asphalt really hard, all of a sudden you might have some trouble that you can't handle. But I got a couple of other questions for you here.
Go ahead.
Let's see. Chris Coulter, Mr. Knight, what gearing did you run?
I get that question a lot as well. I was riding a 2018 500 EXC. And I ran a 50-tooth rear. Brent was on a 2020 500 EXC, and he ran a 52-tooth rear and just stock front countershaft, which I think is a 14. And for me, a stock on that bike is a 45. The 50 was ideal. It would run out of top end pretty good on the roads. 65 was fine. Anything above that's pretty buzzy. I mean, it'd do 80 plus, but you're revved out. So we would really just keep it down to 60, 65 because Brent's was geared a hair lower than mine. And if I were to do it again, I would run the same gearing. I wouldn't necessarily run a 52. I felt like other than maybe the Lundy switchbacks on day 9, I only remember one time getting my bike hot as far as boiling over with that gearing. So it worked for me. Again, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, all I was going to say is I concur with that completely. I don't think I've ever heard anybody say my gearing wasn't tall enough. When you hit the transfer sections, just take it easy.
Exactly.
All I need for my bike to be able to do is 65 for short bursts, so you don't get run over in some of the roads you got to be on. Like when you're going down that road from Lowell to the trailhead, you got to go a couple miles down a road at 65 miles an hour. And my bike, the way I gear them, it's tapped out about right there.
Yep.
But as long as you can do even 60 for short bursts, you're going to be just fine. Your bike's going to be a lot happier, I think, with lower gearing, and so will you. You won't be slipping your clutch. And, slipping the clutch, especially with a Recluse, in a Recluse, your motor's going to run hotter because that clutch slips a lot. So if you gear it lower, you're going to make your engine a lot happier from not only the fact that it's revved a little higher, but that clutch isn't slipping as much and building up as much heat.
Yep.
One
thing we noticed.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Just a quick comment on that. The other thing that I like with that is then second gear becomes a much more manageable and usable gear, because first is typically, even with stock gearing, in my opinion, too low a lot of the times, as far as conserving energy and not feeling like you're always revving and bouncing off rocks. A good technique in the rocks and when you can climb is if you can pull a little bit taller gear, you're actually getting more traction to the ground and you're actually conserving a little bit of energy. So that was another upside to the gearing that we ran.
So there is a question here and a little bit of a discussion about big tanks and airflow. There's no doubt about it that big tanks restrict airflow a little bit. And one of the things that I do, and I'll tell you what I did first, and I'll let Michael talk about what they might have done, is I wrap all of my fuel lines in reflective tape. I wrap them all in insulated foil tape to sort of keep the heat away from the fuel. I wrap the entire inside of the tank with reflective material before I set it over the bike. And then I'm a big fan of the TrailTech fan because it's programmable, and I run that TrailTech fan. I've thought about running two of them, but I run one, and I have the thing set so it triggers at, I think, 169, which is the lowest I think it'll come on. And I've had some people just put them on a switch so that they run all the time. There's nothing wrong with that either. But if you run that TrailTech fan, or anybody, there are a number of fans that'll work. I like the TrailTech, but if you run that fan, you insulate your tank properly, I think it's fine. I think you can get by with a big tank. I mean, everybody that shows up has an oversized tank because it's really tough to make your nut without some sort of an oversized tank. Where we see trouble is with boiling fuel, and typically those riders are running a lean engine, so the motor's like a grenade. It's running hot. And they also haven't done anything to isolate their tank from that tremendous heat that the engine is putting out. Michael, what do you think?
Well, you're spot on, and we didn't do anything particularly unique about that. We were both running. It's pretty much the standard when you see any tour bike come through. And I had an IMS 4.2 or 4.5 gallon on mine, and Brent had an Charity's tank, and we did the same thing, the typical reflective to kind of help with the heat. Our buddy Charles, who made it to day 4 with us, he was running a 2019 250 Husky, a TPI, and he did boil his gas going up Robber's Roost on day 1, and we had a few issues there. So, but yeah, I mean, as far as you pretty much have to have a bigger tank, so just take the necessary precautions and but we didn't do anything unique or out of the ordinary that anybody else doesn't already do in that regard.
Do you remember those guys that showed up? It might have been last year where the guy crashed on day 1 and he had the spiral fracture of the tib. It was either last year or it might have been the year that you did it. But do you remember that team? I think they were the first team out.
Yeah, that was the year we did. He crashed on day 1, right?
Yeah. And they waved off the helicopter. Younger
guys. They were up by close to your place, right?
Yeah, they were. And those guys were on stock tanks. They would have, if that guy hadn't broken his leg, they'd have had a really interesting time starting the next day. But when they showed up, they had like whatever the stock, they had 350s, and whatever the stock tank is on a 350, that's what they had.
I mean, if you were super diligent in the use of your throttle, and you were carrying a gas bag, and you knew your exact mileage, and you had no issues, you might be able to pull it off. But to me, it was just nice to have the peace of mind, the insurance, because you never know when you're going to have to backtrack. You got to reroute a 40 miles due to a fire. You have to have a little bit of insurance. you can't be running it that close. It's going to bite you over 10 days, 13 days, I guess, in this case.
Or if you're a mere mortal like I am, you tip your bike over and the fuel
Oh, yeah.
starts to come out. Michael Knight never has to worry about
Oh,
stuff
rather.
like that because he floats above the terrain like an angel.
Oh, man. It's getting deep in here.
One year I did it on one of those big Baja tanks. I had a 7-gallon tank that would fit my 450. And I tried it one year with that. I went out my initial trip, my sawing trip, and I had that big tank on there. And I hated it because the bike just handles horribly. Yeah, it's okay for Baja, but it's not. I don't even know if it's okay for Baja. I know a lot of people use them, but on single track, it just makes the bike handle like a pig. And on Windy Ridge, several years ago, they did a reroute, so this isn't there anymore. But there used to be a place on Windy Ridge where there was actually a cliff and a side hill. You go right along this cliff, and a boulder had fallen down. And I physically couldn't get the bike to squeeze between the boulder. I had to take the struts off the bottom. I had to go back down the trail, take those struts off, and then just like push the hell out of that bike to squeeze it through that space between the cliff and the boulder to get it through. And I said, screw this. I'm not ever taking a big tank like that again. Okay, let's see. Michael, how much extra fuel did you pack running the 4.5-gallon tank?
Most days, I didn't carry any extra. I remember the day, I remember it in Elk City. That was the day. So I did it in 2020. The route's a little bit different this year. And Brent and I remember we gassed up in Elk City. I carried I had a 2-gallon giant loop gas bag. Plus I had 2 or 3 Gatorade bottles strapped in every crazy concoction. If you watch my video, you see him because we got into that stinking marsh right out of Elk City, and we were hopping logs and
the fire swamp.
There's Wale straps of gas cans and stuff just flopping all over the place. So that was the big one because we had to make it all the way to Lowell that night, and then all the next part of the next day. And then I think for a little bit of insurance, I remember putting some gas in on day somewhere around North Fork, day 5 or 6, and that was just for insurance. So really, the tour, the iteration of the tour in 2020, there was one day where you really had to have it, and I think there was one other day where I carried it for a little bit, but then I just dumped it in, and even then it was maybe only like a gallon. With my tank, I could get 40 plus miles to the gallon pretty consistently. Worse if I was really twisting the throttle, and better if I was being super conservative. So I had really pretty good range with my bike. Brent, and I was getting this question through a private PM earlier today, almost this exact question. And for whatever reason, on his 2020, he didn't get as good a gas mileage. So he was only getting about 35 or so out of his.
Wow. I've never gotten less than 40 miles a gallon on a tour bike.
Yeah.
Never. That's really weird.
Mine was consistently, I could 40 on the low end, 45 pretty much as an average for me.
That across all 4 bikes I've done a tour on, that's 5 actually. That's what I've gotten, somewhere between 40 and 45. One other thing that I tell people is, the giant loop gas bags are really good. Don't get one big one. Get 2 of the smaller ones, whatever you want to do, so you can balance the load a little bit better. An oversized tank, but there are days that, those red plastic gasoline jugs are pretty darn cheap. You can buy one anywhere for a few bucks. And like when I leave North Fork or I leave Elk City, I buy one of those gas cans and I fill it up with gas, like a 2.5-gallon can. And I hate to, think of myself as a human torch, but I'll just bandolier it around my shoulder because I know I'm riding transfer section for a long way. You're just riding down a road. Set it on your seat in front of you if you want to. But I'll take a plastic gasoline can. Doesn't have to be a very big one. You can get a gallon one if you want to. Ride down the road for 30 miles because a lot of times you have these things that are essentially just transfer sections. It's not very hard. Dump it. Find a picnic table. Set the thing on the picnic table somewhere where somebody will think, God smiled on me. Look at this swag. So it's not like you're making the world a worse place by leaving it on a picnic table. I do that all the time. I'll buy 3 or 4 of those along the way somewhere just because that's a very easy way to make sure that you're never worried about fuel. All right. we're going to bring in a guy here who's been real patient. He's been sitting here, and it's time to bring him in. We have a guest tonight, Sean Smith. Sean Smith rides and saws more trail than anybody I know. This is not as much of a human being as it is. He's like he's like the Terminator or something when it comes to trees. He rides all these trails, saws them. This guy rides more trail than anybody. Did the tour last year as a soloist, and he's out in the middle of Idaho right now. Are you in your RV there, buddy?
I am. We're at the bottom of Morgan Creek. We just cut that out yesterday.
Sweet. Now, you haven't, you're sworn to secrecy, but you've been back into some of these new places and you've ridden. Did they put a smile on your face?
I like day 3, day 4 mystery. It is the best trail in Idaho I've ridden. I've ridden a lot of Idaho. People will swear at you. I guarantee you they will be swearing at you on one of those sections, but when they get to the top, they'll realize it was all worth it. And that those trail sections after the one tough one are amazing. Like the best I've ridden.
And the part about that that's gnarly, I rode it in the fall, and so crossing most of those creeks were dry. It wasn't that much of a deal. But he reminded me, and I do remember when I went through there last fall, there's like a bunch of creek crossings that, they got like these weird banks where it drops off real steeply. Then you got to get out the other side. And the rocks were slick when I was in there, so I did push across a lot of those. I got off the bike and just pushed it down, pushed it through the rocks, and none of them are like smooth. They have big, sharp rocks in them, and you got to worry about that a little bit. So after I talked to you at first, I said, what? Is he worried about that part up at the top where it's kind of steep? And then I remembered, no, there were a bunch of creek crossings there, and if they have water in them, I bet they're a lot worse.
They're very unassuming. Like the stuff you think is hard is just, it's fine. You just ride the bike and just keep bumping along there. But those creek crossings are they aren't river crossings. They're just these random little drainages, and they're slippery. Like, watch your feet. Be careful.
Yeah, it's like they're 6 feet wide, a lot of them. They're just not very big. And when I rode them, they were mostly dry. So that makes a little bit of a difference. And I thought about it, and I kept going, what's he talking about? Did I get the trail wrong? Did I ride the wrong trail or something? And then it occurred to me, I think I kind of know what was up.
And as long as you're careful in them, as long as people are careful, with them, be careful.
Yeah.
Just, like I've always believed when it comes to water crossings, I will take a wet boot any day of the week over a drowned bike. So just be conservative, get across it.
You and I have talked about this before. In fact, the three of us have talked about this. I push across side hills all the time in tour style riding. I push across almost every creek. Rarely do I ride across a creek because the 30 seconds that you might save trying to just power across that creek is not worth the 90 minutes that you're going to spend getting the water out of your cylinder and your exhaust system and everything if you dump it. It's one of those kind of things that's not worth the effort. It's the same with side hills. Every time I do Custer, I admire guys that are just on the gas going around that last switchback. Dude, I get off and push around that last switchback. The hell with it. I'm not dumping my bike off that. That's nuts. So that's good advice, right? Make sure your wet feet, they'll dry out. But if you dump your bike in some of these creek crossings, you're going to be there for a long time. So without giving anything away, I know that you like the day 3 stuff, but the day 4 stuff's pretty cool too, isn't it?
The day 4 stuff is like just crazy fun. Like just crazy fun.
I knew you'd like it.
It is like day 3 has got the one legit technical and then just views you will remember for a decade to come afterwards. But the day 4 stuff is just like crazy fun. The one thing I would say about day 3, it's a long day. Like everybody should, like Michael said, you need to be getting up early on every tour day anyway. It's better to have plenty of time to get a beer at the end of the day if it goes great. So start at 4:35. But day 3, start early. You're going to want to take your time through that last part of it and just keep giving yourself energy, the ability to rest and everything like that. Did I lose you?
There we go. We're back now.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, like day 3, get up early, pace really well. Like Michael said, this is a 10-day thing, and day 3, you are really going to want to pace it. You need to conserve your energy because you'll need it at the end of the day. And then after struggling, it'll be like, oh my God, now I understand. Like this stuff is why. And then day 4 is just like the cherry on the ice cream. But it's just unbelievably good.
The thing about day 3 that makes it long too is there's some transfer sections in there that are long, and once you get to the trails, they're kind of cool. But yeah, some of that quad trail and stuff you got to ride. It's not technical, but it takes a while to get through it. And I thought I tried to put it through the best way that I could do, but I may have to think about that a little bit next year because that's a long day. Day 4, I don't think is that bad unless you do the challenge section or the bonus. Did you do either of those?
I did not. I had no
inclination. If you do that challenge section, now that's a man challenge section right there. And there's a reroute which makes it a little bit easier, but it's sort of there's a wicked side hill back in there. I mean, a side hill that'll make grown men cry. And what they did was they just transferred the side hill from one location to another. So there's still side hill, but it's just in a slightly different spot. Did you get to this stuff between the mystery part between Chalice and Salmon? Did you get a chance to do any of that?
No, I'm actually riding it tomorrow afternoon. I've got a friend who knows it well, and he's been trying to get me to ride this and the day 3-4 stuff for the last few years since I've been coming up here, and I've just never made the time. So we're going to ride that tomorrow. Make sure it's all clear, and I'm looking forward to it. I hear it's amazing.
It's if you have a friend that knows the area, he's probably giving you the intel. And there's more stuff that we can put up there, but I got to get up this fall and ride it all and make sure that we can fit it in somehow. But there's 2 more single track trails that we can stick in there that I didn't put in this year because I didn't have time to ride them at the end of last season. One of them is a seasonal closure, and the other one I just didn't have time to get to, but that's on my schedule this year to try to get up and ferret all that stuff out. Now, introduce yourself. Tell everybody who you are. Tell everybody how you are in this fortunate position where you get to do whatever the hell you want.
So I'm lucky. I'm in software development. So I've been a software developer for a long, long time now. I'm a manager, so I've got people who do real work, and I get to work remotely. My wife's a teacher, so we come up here Memorial Day and we stay at her about Labor Day because she's off in the summers. And recently we got ourselves a nice big camper and added Starlink, and now my life is it was pretty good before, but now it's really, really good because I can stay. In the middle of that day 3-4 stuff, I was there for 10 days, just hanging out there, working remote, riding that trail. Now we're up near Morgan Creek, and then I'll go do a stint up in North Fork as well. So I'm lucky for that. My job lets me do it.
That's awesome. That's completely awesome. Starlink is a shiz-nizzle, isn't it?
It is an upgrade in your life. And when they made the RV plan, which they just brought out, was probably the best marketing thing ever. Like literally one person I rode with had it and I brought it. And then since then, 6 of my friends have all gone and purchased it. It is so good. Being able to turn it on and off from month by month and go stay wherever. It is a good upgrade.
we never bought the RV plan. We're going to have to now because they wised up, but I used to just take my dish with me.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And they figured out that a lot of people were doing that, and I don't. You still may be able to get away with that. I don't know, but
you can. The friend I learned about it. He had the residential, and he just had it permanently mounted on his moto van.
Mm-hmm.
And it works well.
Starlink is the shiz-nizzle, and like Idaho, if you live up near Morgan Creek, those people live in cabins out in the wood. They got a big federal grant. They have the fastest internet in the planet, so those guys are getting like gigabit speeds. But if you live a mile outside of the city limits of Pocatello, which I do, you're stuck with like a copper cable internet. So Starlink was like a godsend. When we got this here, all of a sudden life began. I got a static IP, and now everything rocks. Yep. So tell us about your tour of Idaho last year, and there's some questions for you. You're asking the right guy about saws, too. This guy knows more about them than anybody. I will tell you this. I like to think that I'm a data-driven kind of a guy, and a good data point is Sean. He changed my mind about something last year because I carried power saws the first few years of the tour, but it was quite different back in those days. And I'd go out at the beginning every year, and I'd saw a lot, then come back. Then some years I'd try to just do it again. After I sawed my way through it, I'd come back a month later and just try to ride it. And as it got more and more technical, the days, there weren't big mile days. Like the original tour of Idaho was 5 days, and it was like 1,700 miles long. So there were some big, long days in there. But as it got more technical, you couldn't do that. We had to make the days shorter, and it got a lot harder to carry a saw. And the last time I carried a saw, I carried it on a rear mount, and I ripped the rear subframe off my bike carrying the saw. I had to ride up to, it wasn't Sundance back in those days. It was all the way up the Canadian border with my rear subframe and the saw duct taped to the handlebars. So that got me out of that. And so Sean comes along last year, and he said something that I thought about a lot, and he was absolutely right. He says, I think I'll save energy by carrying the saw. And it was absolutely the right call. Why don't you tell everybody about your thinking and tell everybody a little bit about your tour last year, because it was a really important tour. You basically made history by carrying that power saw all the way through it.
Yeah, the thing with the saw and the fact you've made it mandatory, near mandatory, certainly highly, highly recommended, is great in so many ways. Like now, everybody who carries a saw, every tree they cut is making the trail better for everybody else. And when you're carrying a saw, when you come up on a tree, now a tree is an opportunity for a rest. When you don't have a chainsaw, every tree you've got is a challenge. Are you going around it? You're going over it? Are you three of you, if you've got a team of three, dragging your bike over that horrible big thing on a side hill? When you've got a saw, now it's just a chance to take a break, get off, cut that tree back, and go around it. So it's about, sure, it's more energy all the time, and that's the argument against carrying a saw. But it's Idaho. Like, there are burn areas in North Fork, there are burn areas in Morgan Creek. I'll have cut it today, and I guarantee you when they come through next weekend, they'll be cutting trees again. And just having the saw just gives you a chance to take a break. I was on the fence because I always ride with the saw. I've ridden with the saw since I've been riding, pretty much, because I'm not a good enough rider. I started riding with the saw like year one. I've only been riding like 7 years. It was like easier to cut it than learn to hop it. But even that, starting next year, it's like, God, do I carry the saw? But it just took me clear, because we spend June clearing the Yankee Fork area around Stanley. Like that's generally about an 1,100 cut June for me, my wife, and my friends. And we went back there. I went back there later in the year, and trails I'd cut, I still cut 20 trees out of like 4 weeks later. And that just convinced me to ride with the saw. And you'll see some, particularly as you get further north, some really big trees down that you cannot silky. You're going to have to, if you didn't have a chainsaw, you'd be winching your bike over. And as a soloist, I have no choice, right? You don't have a friend to help get your bikes over. Like when you're a team 2 or 3, you got to deal with it. And it was just, for me, meant I could get through the tour. I almost screwed it up anyway because I ran bib and tubeless. so my whole tour came down to that. I rode day 9 and 10 on a flat rear tire and worrying about my bib crawling up the Sundance. So I almost screwed myself anyway. But the saw meant that I could get through the trails in my own mind. I knew I could ride the trails, and I knew I could get through with the saw.
Hey, Martin.
Yes.
Sorry, can I comment on that? First
Sure.
of all, just a thank you to Sean, and just a thought or a kind of a comment or observation. One of the cool things, and I've seen this evolution just in the last year or two, but and I don't know if it's just my own awareness. It's not like I've not sawed before. It's not like I haven't ridden in groups of people that carry saws, but I feel like there's a little bit of a momentum and a movement of it being in vogue, basically, to carry a saw. And I'll be honest, even though I ride in groups that have saws, I did not own or carry a saw on a consistent basis until this year. And I've been up in Wyoming the last on some awesome, great single track and different things, helping clear and do different things. And I feel like as part of the tour community, this is kind of a shift in momentum to being part of the solution rather than part of the problem. So thank you to Sean. I think it's a great
I was
move.
talking with Ross Williams at the sawmill, and he said made the same observation. He said it's become much more like cool to be a part of the clearing community than before. Like there's always been guys, like there are all sorts of names, some of which Martin knows really well, who have been clearing for a long time. But now it's much more sort of common and it's sort of expected. And there's, you look through the various social media groups now, and the number of people posting up their soaring summers, it's only a good thing. And it only makes the trails better for everybody.
It does. And a bit of information that, you and I discussed last year when we were talking about, to carry or not to carry. There is something that's happened with saws that really makes that decision a little easier. You can get a hell of a chainsaw now that weighs 7 or 8 pounds.
Yep.
It's not like 20 pounds like they were a decade or so ago. You use, what is it that you're using now?
So I run the Steel 194T, which is the
Okay.
193, 194. They're about the same. I
Mhm.
run a carbide chain, and I would definitely recommend that, because one
Yeah.
mistake with a carbide doesn't matter. You're not cutting a lot when you're on the tour. Like, I ran really late last year deliberately. I went as late as possible to avoid the storms, but there was much traffic before, and I still cut probably 20 trees the whole trip. So you don't need a lot of cutting capability, but you do need a powerful saw, because the trees you're going to have to deal with are big. These are not the little lodge poles where, a home saw could get through. You're dealing with the big problems. Otherwise, you go around them or move them. So you do need a good saw. So the 193 is what I ran. There's an Echo, I think 255 is the equivalent. And then I run the Build Art mount, because it pulls the saw right up against the forks and has the least impact on handling of any of the mounts out there. It's also one of the cheapest.
Yeah.
So that's the
Those
setup
mounts are
I
good.
run. Yeah.
Yeah.
But then the other thing, you got to solve your light too. So we all ride in the dark. You got an hour and a half, 2 hours in the dark every day.
Yeah, I have a solution to that. Next time you're down this way, I'll show you what I'm doing. But I have a mount that so far has worked pretty good. I haven't done a lot of heavy duty work with it yet, but I have a little home engineered mount that does not require the removal of your headlight mask. And as long as you're using a small saw, you couldn't do it with a big saw. But these little light saws, it keeps it right down where it's out of the way. It blocks the light a little bit, but you do not have to remove the headlight mask. The only problem is it works with KTMs and Huskies. I don't know what else it'll work with, but I'll show you the next time you're by.
I'd love to see it.
And I might even make one for you, give it to you so you can try it out and see what you think.
The other thing, there was a good question in there as well in terms of stuff. So this is what I carried for supply. So this is two-stroke oil, and we've all got plenty of 91 gas, and I just knew my saw and wrote on it on the saw 5.5 mils. That's how much two-stroke oil was needed for an empty tank, because I figured I'd forget that in the stress of the moment. And then this is as much bar and chain as I carried. And much like your gas can thing, you'll find bar and chain along the way if you ever ran out of this, and you just buy it at the local store, fill this up, it's 250 mils, that's all I had. Leave the rest of it, give it to the best looking redneck in the area who happily will take bar and chain from you. and make a friend out of it. And that's all I carried. I carried one spare chain just in case I jammed it more than anything, and that was it.
Those carbide chains are pretty sweet. You have the Lightning kit on yours, the same as I have on mine, I think, right?
Yeah, the 16-inch bar, the 050 width. Yep.
Yeah, and it's a buy once, cry once kind of thing, and you will cry when they show you the bill that you're going to have to pay to get it. But I haven't saw it a lot the last 2 years, but the year before I had my hip, I went out with those IDPR guys. I spent a lot of time with those IDPR crews. A big day for those guys is 1,000 trees. Those guys are animals. They're really good at what they do. And I remember thinking that I was hot stuff if I saw like 50 trees in a day, and those guys are going, what? You think that's a big day? But I would go out with those guys, and I sawed, trying to keep up with those guys, and I got almost one full season out of a carbide chain. And in the end, it wasn't so much that it was dull, it's just that it was real loose.
Right.
They get really loose before they wear out. The only problem with a carbide chain, and maybe you know a solution to this that I don't, you have to have a diamond sharpener to sharpen it.
Yeah,
so you're not going to sharpen it out in the woods.
You cannot sharpen it on trail. But I do a carbide chain a summer, and I'll cut root balls just literally down a root ball when I'm clearing. On the tour, I had a brand new saw for it, but like in a normal clearing thing, I'll just cut a root ball, and it doesn't matter. Like, the carbides are that good. They really do hold up.
All right, you guys, we got two people here that I would certainly ask questions of if it were me. These are two of the best guys. We've had Spooner and Jeff Jensen and Jeff Stess and all these guys on that are like the people that I would tell you, if you don't want to talk to me, talk to these guys, because they're the ones that you need to get information from. I'm very picky about who I bring on these shows, because there's a lot of people I like a lot, but they're not exactly fountains of wonderful information about the tour. And I think these guys have a much better perspective. So you got about 10 minutes left to blaze away. Sean, I think you answered all the questions that you have. So do you have just any other pearls of wisdom to drop on people?
No, you've covered it really well in your PBRs, and if they haven't already, they should watch your PBRs from last year. But it all comes down to, like Michael said, you're running a 10, 13-day thing. The speed you start at the beginning of the day, you got to do it 12 hours later. You've got to really pace yourself through the day, and it is a lot lower energy to walk over a rock garden or across a side hill or through a river than try to drag your bike back up 6 feet back up on the trail. Like, just take your time, be conservative, make no mistakes, and it's a lot easier. But you will make mistakes. Like Jim's a great rider. He still lost his bike off the side. I had to winch my bike twice last year as well off the side of a trail. It will happen, but try to protect yourself from it.
Michael, you got a question. You see it there?
All right. Don't see it. Sorry.
Michael, what radio setup did you use?
I get that question a lot as well. I use some of the cheapy Baofeng Chinese shortwaves, but we had we actually ran push to talk, so we were wired in. And I remember when we originally proposed that, I wasn't a fan because I did not want I didn't want to have to be dealing with wires. But I'll be honest, in the end, it was one of the things that I thought I absolutely loved because it just made us efficient. We weren't having to stop as frequently, or it was even just a safety thing. I can't tell you how many times we were blazing down a Forest Service road and, there's a side-by-side coming the other direction and we'd radio the guys, behind you or whatever. So that's what we used. It worked for us. Again, there's lots of other great Bluetooth and different things, but it's just range. Range is an issue. So we definitely use the radios and they work great for us. Yeah.
Let me tell you something. You said you use the cheapy Baofangs. I had this discussion with somebody just the other day. Do you know who makes the radios for both race radio and regular radio?
I was going to say, they're just rebranded, right?
They're rebranded Baofeng.
Yep.
Somebody had an argument with me one day about that, and I said, okay, come here. And we took one apart, and I said, what's that say?
Yep. The race radio, the PCI radios, they're the same.
They're
and
all
I
the
ride
same
with,
thing.
I run with a big group of guys, and when we just do normal trail riding, we just stick them in our climb vest, and I have the push to talk here. We don't wire, and we just use them. It's just nice though. Sometimes you get to trail junction and different things. But on the tour, we used them like regular communication as we were riding, so they were worth it for us. Now, if you were a soloist, obviously, or maybe even a two-man team, but for me, it worked.
I would run them on 2-man because, I use the BCA radios with my wife, and we use them all the time when we're riding.
Yep.
They're just so handy to have. 2-man, I would run them for sure, like at BCA or the Ruggeds, whatever.
Yeah, and that's the beauty. If you have my son does a lot of snowmobiling and stuff and snow biking, and he has the BCA radio, and we were just in Wyoming last weekend and using them. They all work same as long as you're on the same channel. So if you have something like that, you can leverage it. And that's another way. Yeah, you could go out and just they're more money, but they work very well. They're very good.
Do you know why I always ride by myself? Because I don't want to talk to anybody on the radio.
I knew that.
When I hear that thing go, it drives me crazy because when my 20-year-old son used to ride with me, I had a radio just for safety reasons. And those things, every once in a while, they go off. You get a little burst of static in those things. And every time that happens, I want to pee my pants.
There's a quick question there on carbide in terms of the bar. I run the 050 bar because it's a wider bar. It cuts better. I've never tried to shop a carbide outside of that size, but just go to Ace or anybody like that. But the bar you have, ask them if they can get carbide for that bar. If they can't, you may need to go to a different bar anyway, which is the 050, I think, is a better bar than the stock, which is an 042 or something, I think.
Yeah, I went to the local, there's a place down here, Pro Rentals, that's like a really good steel dealer. Those guys know what they're doing. And they said for the carbide chain, you absolutely want to run this special bar that they have, and it's the 050 bar. They said you'll like it a lot better. The chain will last longer. Now, you're going to cry when you see what they're going to charge you for it. But, again, it's unheard of to get an entire season out of a chain. I hit rocks with mine all the time. You said you saw all the way through tree balls and stuff. When I get mine into dirt and stuff, I don't try to do that. But if I do it, it doesn't dull the chain automatically like it does on a regular chain.
Yep.
And the carbide chains themselves, you can buy some that aren't that expensive. They're not as good as the really expensive ones. But just in terms of spares, you can get a pretty decent carbide chain for around $50.
Well,
The really
when
good
you think
ones are about
about
$100.
think about what you're spending on the tour. Like everybody on this knows what they're spending between rooms, gas. A lot of us brought brand new bikes for it. To buy a $50-$70 carbide chain to help you be successful, or an $80 bar, that to me was like peanuts on the dollar. Like I was more than happy to spend that to help set me up for success.
Okay, Sean Casey says, any experience with throat mics? This is coming from the audio engineer in the audience out there. I don't know anything about throat mics. Do either of you guys?
No.
Yeah.
I don't.
I use like hand signals, stuff like this, go away, things like that. That's what I use instead of any of that stuff. All right, we're getting up on the hour here. So what I want to do is, barring any more questions, I want to turn it over to both of you guys. Michael first, you have the floor. Tell everybody anything that you want to tell them. Take your time.
You've made some comments, I think, on whether in some of your previous announcements or the last couple of PBRs. And the one thing that I'll just say, and I kind of let out with this, I commented that there isn't a day that has gone by in the last 2 years that I haven't reflected on the tour in some way. And I don't just mean from a riding perspective. So I don't want to wax too philosophical here, but this is an experience. And it was honestly like a life-changing experience, because it's one of the greatest things I've ever done. And and I'm grateful that I was able to finish, but don't equate the enjoyment that you get out of it, whether you make it to Sundance or not. The preparation, the time that I spent with my friends planning, the engagement and involvement of even my family in it, and the stories that we talk and tell about now are priceless. So go out and just have an experience, have fun. I love to ride my motorcycle. I mean, I absolutely love to ride my motorcycle, and I got to do it for 10 days in Idaho. And whether you do it for 5 days and then you go and do a T2 or whatever ends up happening, just go have a good experience, and you will not regret it.
Sean, you're up.
Yeah, same. Like I've done a lot of things in my life. I have a very obsessional personality, and like Martin, I come from the rock climbing world, and I've done like the nose in a day, and I've led A5. But finishing the tour last year was one of the most rewarding things I've ever done. And I've like Michael and Martin, I've done a lot of stuff as well. It's one of those things you'll remember forever. And no matter how far you get into it, every day will be a challenge. You're going to meet people along the communities, like staying at Kaylin's place, staying at Casey's place. Like these people are just people you remember. And now whenever I'm by there, you're saying hello, they remember you, you remember them. Like you're going to form a relationship along here that you'll just never have had a chance to do without doing something like this. And like Michael said, whether you make Sundance or not, you'll still be challenged, you'll be pushed, you'll be problem solving constantly. It is just one of those things that you'll just look back at and just, I'm going to go and do a little 9-day highlight reel of the tour myself later in the summer, just because it was that good. This is just one of those things that you're going to be stoked to have started. And if you get to finish, if you make it crawling that bike, if you have to carry it on your shoulders up to Sundance at the end, it'll be one of those things you'll remember forever.
One thing that we've talked about a lot, and Jim Spooner talked very well about this. He spoke to this point. The biggest thing I think that's required for success, and both of you guys have touched on this in different ways. Sean, through your climbing background, you know all about this, and Michael, through your racing background. You have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, which is the way Jim Spooner put it. I posted up something on my Substack a few days ago, a little photo of a 40-year-old climbing adventure. We did the Diamond once in almost full-blown winter conditions. Quarter-inch verglass over everything. And I remember sitting on a ledge all night long that was about 6 inches wide, just freezing to death. And, it was cold. And I remember thinking, this is pretty touch and go. But as much as I was uncomfortable, that didn't mean as much to me as the fact that how many people ever get to do something like this? You're going to spend one cold night. It's going to be cold tonight. Tomorrow morning, you're going to get up. The sun's going to come up. You're going to get off this thing, and it's going to be great. Me personally, that's the way I view discomfort in the Tour of Idaho. Look, the people who used to do this did it in covered wagons, right? You got a motor. Shut up. Keep going. If you have to spend the night out, so what? You know, you're going to spend one night out somewhere, you're going to get up the next morning, and you're going to get where you're going to go. The more you can wrap your mind around the fact that you are going to be uncomfortable and you're going to be stressed and you're going to be pushed, and you have to manage that. And not only that, you have to kind of embrace it. You have to sort of say, yeah, I don't mind this. This is kind of part of the experience. I think the better off you are. What do you guys think?
Like, if it was easy, it wouldn't be the same. Like, this is a hard thing. And when you get to the end of it, it was that challenge you overcame. It was the problems you solved. It was the stuff you saw that makes it great, that makes it memorable.
Yep. 100%.
You did have to shiv me. You did have to shiv me a little bit there. Talk about doing the nose in a day when you know it took me 4.
The
Now
first time I did the
I'm gonna
nose,
get
it
in
took me
climbing
5.
shape, and I'm going to go back.
I did the nose the first time, it took me 5. Next year we went back and did it in a day. So.
Yeah, my buddy and I talk about that a lot. You know, we did it back in the early 80s, and we did a very early hammerless ascent. We didn't take a hammer with us, and which was kind of a big deal back in those days. And tri-cams were brand new, and, man, I tri-cammed the hell out of those pin scars.
Yep.
But we had a lot of people, when we did it, you know, we got back, and, like, nobody from Kentucky had done the nose when we did it. We get back, and all these guys are like, well, it took you guys 4 days? God, what's wrong with you? You know, we hear about these guys doing it in a day. And, of course, it hadn't been done in a day at that point. It had been done in a couple, I think. And I don't know when Bridwell and those guys did the first one-day ascent, but it was in that era. And then you go talk to these guys that did the nose in a day, and you'd find out, well, okay, first of all, they've done it a bunch of times. Second of all, what they actually did was climbed up all the way to El Cap Towers, you know, took a bunch of supplies up there. Oh. They kind of wired the route up to El Cap Towers, and then they did a little bit more work, rappelled back down to the ground. And then after that, so this ascent that they claimed took a day was actually like a week's worth of effort doing different things, plus they'd done the route in advance. But I'm still mad that you beat me. You did it in a day. That's pretty snazzy stuff, man. The nose is a long freaking route, and I don't care who you are. It's 3,800 freaking feet. You got to be moving. You got to be hauling ass to do it in a day. Good for you. Well, I got to tell everybody at the same time, every week, you've wasted a perfectly good hour of your life that you can't get back with one knucklehead and 2 people that it was probably worth spending some time with. I see that Jeff Jensen finally entered the room, the man who's too handsome for television. Hey, by the way, Jensen, people are on to you, buddy. These guys that came through the day said, you know, when you talk to Jeff Jensen, I'm not really sure that he has your best interests at heart when he's answering some of these questions. I said, God, what have I been telling people for years? Why do you think I have bets with this guy? But anyway, thank you very much for spending time with us. Let's give it up for our guest and my co-host tonight, 2 super dudes. These are good guys to talk to if you have any questions. I am having one more riders meeting tomorrow night. There were enough teams that missed out on them all this year. I put it up on the forum. There's one tomorrow night. I think I'm doing it at 5:30, but I posted it up on the forum. If you haven't been to a riders meeting, it's your last chance. And there are some teams that I haven't heard from in months. If I don't see them at the riders meeting tomorrow night, or they don't respond to the posts that I've been putting up in the forum and on the Facebook page, I may knock some people off the schedule. Thanks again, Michael. Thanks again, Sean. I really appreciate it. And I hope I see you guys sooner rather than later, okay?
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.